We planted the Sacred Grace Inglewood about 2 years ago. I've been a part of a church called T&L that meets here on Tuesday nights. I've been with that community since it started in 1993. And like Nathan said, we are in the formative stages of establishing the next parish out on East Colfax. And so that's where we were on Friday praying, walking through a mold-infested building on East Colfax about maybe what's God doing on East Colfax. So the role of executive director, like, don't let that title fool you. Mostly it's walking through moldy buildings. So the text that we're going to look at tonight is Romans chapter 12. And I'm just going to jump in. It's Romans chapter 12, verse 6 to 8. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it's to lead, do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right, so here's a question for you. What is the best gift that you've ever received? This is not a rhetorical question, in fact. Best gift you've ever received?
Our car.
Your car. That is good. That is a good gift.
My
Dog?
Someone paying for shipping.
Somebody paying for shipping. Amazon?
No.
No.
A friend, just a friend.
Okay. A friend. Not like Jeff Bezos or whoever owns Amazon. That's good. That's not really a gift. You pay for that, by the way. What's the best gift you've ever given? Guys, at this point, you could say ring. Like that, you know, that's in the category, you know. So have you guys ever read this book, like these 5 love languages? You know, some people talk about like they're gift givers. My family, my daughter, my dog, and I think we all like gifts, and we're like all coming into the season of which it's our birthday. Within 4 days, there's 3 birthdays, which is a good time. We've decided that the easiest person to shop for in our family is our dog. He likes treats. He's not particular about which treats, as long as they have some sort of peanut butter or baconness to them, right? So he's pretty easy. My daughter's turning 9, so she's becoming a little bit more particular about her gifts, meaning the clothes now have to be a certain color. There used to be a time we actually went shopping this weekend for flip-flops, and I was like, Sweet Pea, I remember like when I just used to go to the store and buy you flip-flops, and you didn't say anything, and now you have a lot to say about like what color your flip-flops are. I'm 45. I've got a lot of opinions about everything, including gifts, both given and received, but gifts are funny. And so tonight I want to look at gifts. This series that we've been in is the season of Pentecost, which is really an extended celebration of the work of the Spirit in our lives. And the worksheet that was on your sheet, on your seat, is a sheet on your seat. Cautious with that. We could get in all sorts of trouble. And what we've been walking through these 5 weeks are these 5 blanks. So week 1 was about the work. Week 2 was about the Spirit. And week 3, we're going to talk about the gifts, or the ways that you have been uniquely gifted. Week 4 and week 5, by the way, will be about your work and your world. My hope tonight is simply this, that at the end of the night, your level of self-awareness about the way that God has gifted you would be increased. You would be a little bit more intrigued about exploring who God made you to be and who He has gifted you to be. But then you would also recognize that the reason you have been gifted is actually about how you would gift that gift to others. If you happen to be in the room tonight and you're undecided or maybe even against the idea of following Jesus, and you might be opposed to the idea that I'm going to talk tonight about that you've been gifted by God for some purpose, I would just invite you, listen in about what we believe we should be behaving like, and feel free to let us know if we're behaving in such ways. I have a friend who's been in my life for almost 15 years, has been a self-proclaimed agnostic for all those years, and in a conversation once about his skills and abilities, I just said, I think that you are one of the most generous, gifted people that I know, and you're always saying thank you, you just don't know who you're saying thank you to. So maybe you're in the room tonight and you are an incredibly gifted and generous person in the way that you live your life, and simply you might not have come to the point yet in which you would say, I know who I'm saying thank you to. I believe that the Spirit is always at work in all of our lives. There's a lot of different views on at what point does the Spirit indwell us. But as best as I can tell from reading the scriptures, the Spirit is always the one who is moving us closer to God wherever we are on that trajectory. For the rest of us, the invitation tonight is maybe you've heard a talk about spiritual gifts before. There's 3 primary texts in the New Testament that talk about spiritual gifts. There's one in Romans 12, and Paul says this. He says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. So there's some level, as Romans 12, as we'll look at tonight, begins to unpack that there's different sorts of gifts. 1 Corinthians 12, Paul writes again, he says, I want to talk about now the various ways that God's Spirit gets worked out into our lives. And then he unpacks that in chapters 12, 13, 14. And then the other text is in Ephesians chapter 4. So there's these 3 different texts. And I grew up with a lot of different attempts at trying to synthesize them or organize them or like just have like one monster list. And then you have like this little test where it was basically like multiple choice. And you're trying to figure out like how do you get the good gifts and not the bad gifts. And that was kind of not helpful for me. And so what was helpful for me about 4 years ago, I had a friend in New York who, in a profound way, began to unlock a perspective that helped me understand that ultimately what gifts were about coming to know who God had created me to be and increasing in self-awareness so that I could lead and serve others. And so he, because he alliterated, which is why I loved him, he alliterated these 3 texts, Romans 12, Ephesians 4, and 1 Corinthians 12 as this. Romans 12 is where we start to talk about what the gifts are, and we talk about what our passions are and what our motivations are. In Ephesians 4, we talk about where our gifts start to play out within the church, our place in the church. And then in 1 Corinthians 12, we start to look at how the gifts of the Spirit begin to show up in both power and presence. And so if you look at these 3 texts, almost like a combination lock, I would offer that every person in this room has a unique combination of gifts, both of passions, of place, and of the power and the presence of the Spirit of God. And so there's no like one gift that you've been given, and neither are you just your gift on its own. The gifts of the Spirit, I think, are a really fascinating way to engage self-awareness and self-discovery so that you can better understand who you are. One of the songs that we were singing tonight, there was a line in it that reminded me of the prayer of St. Francis, Francis the bird, not Francis the Pope. And so one of the prayers that Francis used to go away for months to pray, he would go to a cave and he would say, help me know myself that I may know thee. The other version is, who are you, who am I? Augustine has been quoted as the same thing. And so there's this some sense that the saints understood that the more that they come to understand themselves, the more that they would come to understand God. And I can't remember what song it was tonight, but we sang this line of like, I want to know you, I want to know me. So tonight we're going to look at just a little bit of the gifts. When I was talking to Nathan and Phil, who pastors TNL, about this talk, I said I would love to sit around and talk to people about this for a little bit longer than 20 minutes. And so on June 30th, it's a Saturday morning, I'm going to be here, and I'm going to give like a 20-minute talk on each of these 3 texts, and we're just going to do a workshop about the passions, the place, and the power and the presence. And so if you don't have anything else to do on Saturday morning, and you'd like to sit around and understand a little bit more of how you're wired, I would love to have coffee with you. It'll be here in the conference room, Saturday, June 30th, 9 to 10:45. And we can talk about what are your passions, where is your place in the church, how is the presence and the power of the Spirit demonstrated in your life. So tonight I just want to look at this one text of Romans chapter 8. Tools are great, language is great. One of the things that you have to recognize is most of the time we start using tools incorrectly before we start using them correctly. Most of the time we fumble with language before we get it correct. If we all decided that we were going to learn like Cantonese tonight, other than maybe one person in the room, we're all not going to say anything correctly by the end of the night. So let me caution you, one of the biggest liabilities that I think has to do with like when you start talking about self-awareness is that you're going to misstep and make mistakes, which is why a church is the only place really that I think you can figure out who you are, because you need environments of grace and relationships of trust to ever figure out who you are. Trying to figure out how God has wired you outside of environments of grace and relationships of trust doesn't work because you can't risk and you can't fail. And so the church and the local church and the places that you get to talk to each other is really the only context that works. For me, the church that I've spent the most time in is this kind of family of churches. It was 24 years ago that I gave my first talk. And I was thinking about that first talk, and I so desperately wanted to be liked and wanted to be memorable. How I began the talk was I took some illegal fireworks from Wyoming, and I drilled out about 24 Brussels sprouts and attached the Brussels sprouts to the illegal fireworks, because at a young age, I had like this angsty thing against Brussels sprouts because my mom made me eat them. I've since come to really like Brussels sprouts. And so I basically stood up and I said, "Hi, my name's Jared." And then I lit the fireworks on fire, and then they all exploded. And then I have no idea what I talked about. And that was my gift that I gave to the church that night when I first taught. And I would say that my progression of learning about who I was and how I was wired and what gift I could be to the church took a very slow trajectory in the positive direction. And it took decades for me to sort out who I was and what gifts that I have to offer somebody else. Self-awareness probably took well into my late 20s, if not most of my 30s, to start to come to grips with who I was and how I was wired. And what the pivot was for me was it came to the point where I came to understand that my gifts were not actually given to make me memorable to others. And my gifts were primarily not given to me to make me feel important in a room. In fact, my gifts were primarily about leading others, loving others, serving others. Really, they had to be rooted in love for the good of others. And so as you begin to look and to listen to your own life, I would invite you will start to understand the gifts of the Spirit in your life when you start to look at the places where they are rooted in love and where they are for the good of others. So here's 7 foundational thoughts about gifts. First of all, gifts are grace. They can't be earned. They're not given out as gold stars. They're simply given. The second is that gifts are, in fact, not your identity. It's important to remember that you are not your gift. You are not your giftedness. You are a daughter or a son of a God who infinitely and eternally loves you. That is not based on your giftedness. Also, gifts are not about maturity. We give 16-year-old driver's licenses not because they're good drivers, but just simply we just give them licenses because we want them to drive Ubers for us someday, right? So the reality is like if you look through Scripture, a lot of the people that God uses and gifts are not because they're mature. And so be very cautious to talk about like, well, I've been gifted in this way, so that somehow makes me more mature than someone else. The fourth is that all gifts are equal and vital. Every gift is vital and necessary in the body, in the family of God. If you want to think about like why those things are so important, is just have like a sore tooth or a sore toe. Like the smallest ailments in your human body can wreck you. And I would offer, after being a part of a church for over 20 years, it's often the little pieces that are missing and that are going unnoticed in the church that keep it back from maybe becoming fully who God intended and created it to be. The fifth is that your gift will color how you see everything. One of the most fascinating studies is for me, like walk into a room and drop a piece of trash or spill a drink or purposely like throw a fork on the ground and then just to watch what everybody does. Because how everybody is gifted, the way that they are uniquely wired, they will all respond to that little incident that I create differently. Some people will pick up the fork. Some people would like stare at the fork. Some people will decide I'm leaving this place because there's not supposed to be forks laying in the middle of the floor, right? So everybody responds to the situation differently. And your gift, the way that God has wired you, will impact everything that you see inside and outside the church. The last two, I think, are the two most important, that gifts have to be rooted in love. Paul talks a lot about this in 1 Corinthians. He says, without love, like no matter how gifted you are at best just background noise. You're mayhem. At worst, you might, in fact, be manipulation. And then finally, gifts are given for others. They have to be rooted in love for the good of others. They are given to us to give others. So the best gift that you are ever given from the Spirit is the gift that you will give to the family of God. So the text tonight, if your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, give generously. If it's to lead, do diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. These 7, I think one of these might spark inside of you as one of the pieces of your unique combination lock about how God has uniquely made you. So in the time remaining, I'm going to walk through all 7, and I would just like to ask you to ask the Spirit, would you illuminate one of those for me about maybe how you've wired me? Prophecy. What good does prophecy bring others? I think prophecy brings spiritual good to others. I think in its most helpful, rooted in love sense, prophecy is about helping people hear and respond to God. It's about speaking on behalf of God, which means that you should always do so with incredible caution and care. As one of my friends said, no dates, no mates when it comes to prophecy. That was like funny when I was young. So, unfortunately, depending on how long or what church traditions you've been around, spiritual abuse, I think, is real. And it's mostly people with a prophetic gift that are incredibly immature about it. And it's out of negligence of speaking on behalf of God that they speak probably parts of truth, but they do so not at all rooted in love or for the good of others. Let's talk about serving. Serving is really about the practical good of others, the practical and tangible well-being, about getting things done and about not feeling like that you're having to do life alone. I think the hard thing about people who have been gifted in service is to do so out of some level of not everything is theirs to carry. The immature think that they have to do everything if they've been gifted in serving. The mature start to sift out and serve, I think, where maybe God is calling them. I think it's also important to sort out that there is not actually a better place to serve. Like, your grass is great to mow. You don't need to go mow somebody else's. Let's talk about teaching. I think teaching serves the intellectual good for others. I used to think good teachers were like the people who stood up front, and I'm starting to think more and more good teachers are actually good systems people. They help explain things. Sometimes they don't stand up in front of large rooms, but in a conversation, they can take something that's incredibly complicated in your life and make it very simple. I used to joke around about, like, prophets take simple things and make them complicated. Teachers take complicated things and make them simple. So if you're confused about which two you are in there, you can at least sort that one, right? But teachers help clarify. They make things understandable. And actually, I think the best thing is that teachers don't make it look like magic. Teachers help you learn. They help you understand process. What about encouraging? I think encouraging is about the psychological good for others. It helps you move towards health and wholeness. I think in the word itself, encourage, right? It gives you courage. It puts courage into your heart. It strengthens your heart. I have a friend who lives in Canada. He might be the most gifted encourager that I know. Like, a text from that man, like, I can go months on the way that he can word the Father's heart to me and to different situations that I'm walking through. So people with the gift of encouragement know how to speak courage to your heart. Giving is about the material good for others. It's about this idea when we say a generosity prayer that there would be no one in need among us. I think people who are gifted with the gift of giving understand it is not about amount, but they understand both how to give strategically and directed. They are really good at paying attention to needs, and they're really good at attaching people with means to people with needs. It's not always that they have the most, it's that they know how to see needs and get them met. I also think that they have a lot of fun doing it, and probably one of my friends who is gifted in generosity and in giving the most is probably the least likely person, if you were standing in the room, that you would guess that he is the person who's giving the most. Leading is about a directional good. I think for those who have been given the gift of leadership, they have the responsibility to lead well. The difference between, I think, the spiritual gift of leadership and what we see kind of in a cultural moment around us would be the difference between kingdom and empire. A king who rules a kingdom out of a way that is in the way of Jesus is interested in the good of the person furthest out from them. The emperor who leads an empire is primarily interested in only their good and could care less the farther out that they get from them. So if you want to talk about leaders, leaders are actually interested in the person who's furthest away from them and the good for them. And then mercy. I think mercy is about the emotional good of others. People with the gift of mercy want to make sure that people are seen and heard and known and loved. There's nothing worse than an angry nurse, I've decided. It's the worst thing is like when you feel like dying and you need someone to have empathy and show mercy. It is like suffocating to have no one there. And when you feel like life is overwhelming and you have somebody with the gift of mercy come beside you, there is maybe nothing more life-giving than somebody who has like a bedside manner which comes along while you're hurting, and they don't solve it, but somehow their presence is like a salve to the situation that you're in. So like I said, my hope is that one of these 7 would stand out to you. There is nothing more inspiring than when you see somebody begin to live out of their passions, out of their giftedness. It doesn't look like work. As Michael Jordan would say, it's like with the moment when the game starts coming to you. And I see people that serve in the kingdom out of their giftedness in a way that they make it look effortless because they are not relying on their own strength. They are living in the power and the presence of the Spirit. Peter writes in 1 Peter 4, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. The most important thing is your gift is not for you. Your gift is to be rooted in love for others. And so we've been in this series in which we have been inviting you to think through this little worksheet. And so I'm going to go first and tell you what I've been writing on my little worksheet, right? So the first week we talked about what is the work of the Spirit. And Nathan talked about that the work of the Spirit brings life, it brings hope, it brings peace. For me, it brings pace, right? So in blank number 1, I put the pace, that the guide. So that blank number 2, the Spirit, as Nathan talked about, there's different roles of the Spirit. And you can go through the New Testament and see different roles and the work that the Spirit can do. But the Spirit, as Nathan talked about, was a good therapist. It's a good person, or it's not a good, it is a person and it's a guide. And so for me, the Spirit has long been a guide. I like to primarily be the person in the front, and so the Spirit is usually saying, like, I am leading and you are following. So this is kind of this dance that we do. So I've just wrote that the pace that the guide is doing in the leader is the pace that I am meant to be leading in my family and my church. Right? So those are the last 2 blanks for me. So our hope is that in this series, you begin to personalize the work of the Spirit in you, because the work of the Spirit in you is personal. Who the Spirit is to you is personal. The work that the Spirit is doing in you is personal. The gifts that the Spirit has given to you are personal. And so my hope and my prayer is that you would begin to unravel and unlock that unique combination of giftedness that God has given you to be rooted in love to serve others. Let's pray as we move towards communion. Father, we believe that of all that you have given us yourself, you have given us your Son. And so may we be recipients first. May we receive with joy what you've given. And then maybe we begin to understand like what we've been given is not for us, but it is for others. I pray this in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. Amen.